Thank you, everybody. Our next speaker asked me to keep the introduction brief, but I'm far too much of a fan and I just need to sing her praises if she will indulge me. Professor Tanya Serry is a leading Australian academic in the field of literacy, reading instruction and speech pathology. She currently serves as a professor in the School of Education at La Trobe University and is co-founder of the Science of Language and Reading Lab, SOLAR, established in 2020 with distinguished Professor Pamela Snow. As expected from our conference themes, Tanya's research focuses on evidence-based reading instruction and intervention. She is particularly committed to addressing the social gradient in reading outcomes, and we are all grateful for her work in improving the literacy for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Not only is she collaborating with Aero to study the impact of sustained in-school coaching for early years teachers, but her unique background also enables Tanya to explore the role of speech-language pathologists in literacy education. Further, as Honorary Research Fellow at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, Tanya contributes to policy and equity research, especially in the context of learning difficulties and dyslexia. She is former Editor-in-Chief of the Australian Journal of Learning Difficulties and currently serves on its editorial board. We are delighted to have Professor Tanya Serry with us today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome to the lectern.
Thank you so much, Amelia, for that slightly longer intro than I was anticipating. And thank you very much to all of the organisers here. What a fabulous event, and the communication and planning that has gone into today, both as a presenter and just to see this conference, is truly a credit to you all. Thank you all for being here today. As Amelia said, I am from La Trobe University in Melbourne, Victoria. This is my university on the screen, but unfortunately it's not my building. It belongs to the molecular scientists who bring in far more money than we could ever do to the university. I'd like to acknowledge, before I start, the traditional owners of lands, seas and waters throughout Australia and pay respects to elders past, present and future. We recognise that the health, social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are grounded in continued connection to culture, country, language and community, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Before I start with my presentation, I'd just like to tell you that I will be talking a fair bit, but I've got a couple of opportunities where I would like to invite you to turn and talk or pair share. So I'm going to just practice a very brief attention signal so that we can all come back together pretty quickly. So if you would just indulge me, and there's only a couple of times when I will be using it, but when I say 1, 2, 3, you will say eyes on me. So can we just practice that? 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much, and you will hear that a couple of times. I've also got 2 short videos to show you fairly early on in my presentation, and I'm very grateful to those people who've granted me permission to do so as well. So just as brief background, here is my colleague, my partner in all sorts of crime. Some people think what we do is criminal, others are very grateful for the work that we do, but this is distinguished Professor Pamela Snow and myself. We both joined the School of Education in 2020, coming from other parts of La Trobe University, and we put our heads together and set up the Solar Lab, which is really just a virtual platform. And we, from the Solar Lab, we do a range of activities such as contributing to the ITE program, some short courses, research, and a lot of advocacy, and really trying to connect with practitioners on the ground, both here and internationally. Our team has grown, and this is our current team of a mix of researchers and our administration support, and it's a wonderful team to be a part of. Here's my outline for today. We've got 4 sections. The first 2 are going to be fairly short, and the next 2 will be a little bit longer. So for some of you, what I will be talking about, particularly in the first 2 parts, will be familiar knowledge. But I'm going to talk about reading fundamentals and emphasise the fact that reading is an unnatural act. I'll talk about the simple view of reading just as a framework. And for those of you who were in Greg's workshop earlier, just an alert that we seem to have got some of the same slides, which is interesting as well. Then going to talk about the science of reading. It's a term that really hit our airwaves some years ago, and it's used and maybe slightly overused and abused at different times, but what it really means and current perspectives on what is the science of reading. But then I want to talk mostly about how we transition from literacy, so how young children go from very novice to becoming an expert reader, and I'll talk through how we get children to get words off the page, and then orthographic mapping. And then the critical part, the comprehension or understanding what we read, which really is the ultimate aim of reading. We're going to look at Kinch's model of how we form a text base and how we create a mental model, and the role of oral language and background knowledge. And I should just say there, one of the critical parts when we thought about what the Solar Lab was, what our mission was, and even what we wanted to call the Solar Lab, we were very keen to emphasise the role of oral language in there. So we've expanded, I guess, what is science of reading to the science of language and reading. Pam and I both have a background in speech pathology, so we felt very connected to oral language, but more so the role of oral language is so critical to being able to read for meaning, and I will talk a bit more about that as we go along today. Now, I come to you standing on the shoulders of many, many wonderful academic giants and people that have really helped me in my understanding and the work that I do. And you'll be hearing through me from all of these people and some more as well. But I really wanted to acknowledge the work of Linnea Airy, who's taught us so much about orthographic mapping. William Tunmer, and under his picture is Philip Goff. They were the authors of The Simple View of Reading. Mark Seidenberg is just a wonderful commentator, and you can just Google him and find all sorts of presentations that he's done. He talks about all things reading, and if anyone hasn't come across his book, Language at the Speed of Sight, it's a bit of a thick, dense read, but it's really well worth it, especially chapter 11. David Kilpatrick he's talked a lot about phonemic awareness. I'm not going to privilege that part of his work today. I'm going to talk about his models of how we learn to read in terms of going from novice to expert. And on the right-hand side, Tiffany Hogan, I will be talking about her model of reading called the Reading House. So I just wanted to acknowledge those people. So I've got some headline messages for today, what I'd like to cover. And it's about reading. So we've got an image of a novice reader reading beautiful Dr. Seuss books. He didn't know how clever he was when he was writing his books. They're so beautifully phonically coded and so much rhyme. We've also got reading in the workplace and, of course, reading for pleasure. And we could have so many pictures, but to really highlight and emphasise the fact that reading is just such a fundamental part of what we do as humans, both for academic and social purposes. And this picture just really appealed to me because it just looks so earthy, and just the love of reading just jumps out from this photograph. But my headline messages, what I'd like to communicate to you today, are the following. That humans are not born with a reading brain. We are born with a brain that has evolved to acquire language, oral language, quite effortlessly, but we have not been born with a reading brain. And that has significant implications for instruction and identifying struggling readers. Reading is a language-based skill set. It's not a skill because reading has so many different components, but it is fundamentally underpinned by oral language. Now, oral language and written language, which is another way of saying literacy, reading, spelling, writing, they share many of the same underlying cognitive processes, and linguistic processes, but they are fundamentally different. There's a formality to reading and writing that is not present in the way that we speak verbally to our peers, our friends, and our colleagues. And I'll show you some data shortly, but oral language competency at school entry is a strong predictor of reading success. So again, that's often out of our sphere in the work that we all do because we receive students once they start school. It's really, for me, a public health issue, but the more that can be done to accelerate oral language skills in the preschool years, particularly for those students who for some reason have a delay, perhaps they have English as a second or third language, we know how predictive oral language is for reading success, learning to read. Now, reading comprehension, which is often seen as a unitary skill, is anything but a unitary skill, and I'll talk more about that as well. It's a compilation of many components that make one able to understand what one is reading. And finally, this won't come as any surprise, but the reading skill predicts long-term academic success, future employment, and including health outcomes, both physical health outcomes and psychosocial outcomes. There's evidence to show that reading influences outcomes well beyond the school gates. So, reading really does matter, and the image here is to evoke a sense of a prison. Now, we do know that people with reading difficulties are overrepresented in prisons. That's just a fact that's been demonstrated around the world. So again, there's a vulnerability there of students, young people getting involved in risk-taking behaviours, exiting school early, and a range of other social complexities. And it often, there's a higher rate of entering the youth justice or the adult justice system. But not being able to read proficiently when we leave school is also like being in a virtual prison because of the life limitations that can occur. My computer seems to be jumping ahead without me controlling it in this slide, but reading is absolutely central to many activities and both in terms of academic and social accomplishments at and post-school, and allows for meaningful engagement in the economic, the political, the social mainstream. Think about the ability to vote or make decisions about who you'll vote for. Think of just engaging in social media. Reading is fundamental to everything we do, probably more now in our technological age than ever before. And conversely, poor reading proficiency, as I alluded to earlier, is associated with a range of negative sequelae, including health, including risk-taking behaviours, including entering the justice system, and not economically having a lot more struggles to support oneself throughout. So that's really set the scene for today. So let's start with some reading fundamentals. And the first thing that I'd like to do is to play you two videos. I won't say too much about the videos, but I'd like you to watch them. They're both very short, shows young children reading, and I'd like you to think. I will be asking you to talk to each other about what you saw and what you think is going on for these two students.
Little horse zips down the tree. She hops up on the wall. Oh, there is that bad dog. As little puss jumps off.
Very good reading, and I like how you do the exclamation mark. That's good.
Okay, that's the first one.
Little puss zips.
And here's the second one.
Chapter 2, The Game. Wow, this must be a long book. How many pages? 16. Chapter 2, The Game. Cold milkshakes, exclaimed Danny. Great for such a hot day. It's getting late, said Erin. Jack will be awake soon. Let's play the space game. It was a great game, and they often play it when Danny came to the flat. Race you to it, yelled. Race you to it, yelled Danny as he jumped up. So brave of you to risk failing. Again, mocked Erin. What does that mean?
Okay, just give you 1 minute. I know it's a very brief time, but we are pretty condensed with time. I'd like you just to share with people sitting nearby what you saw, and can you explain why there were obvious differences between the two children's readings? Just 1 minute to do so. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much. I won't have time to seek feedback from you. Throughout the presentation, there will be some explanations of what you saw, but you could clearly see one student was more advanced than the other. When I talk about the Kilpatrick model, I will link back to what you just observed in those clips. But let's now just have a look at some reading fundamentals. I think I've made it pretty clear, and I'm sure you all know that most of us read every day, and probably with the professions that we've chosen, we probably enjoy reading. But keeping in mind that we have not been born with a human brain, it's one of the most complex things that we ask students to master. And I'm going to talk shortly about the fact that it's considered to be a biologically secondary skill. So let's have a look at that now. What we mean by biologically secondary, it can be compared on the flip side with biologically primary skills, and David Geary was a real leader in this area. I just should also let you know you will get access to the slides, a PDF of the slides, and there's a big reference list for anything that is on the slide. Now, biologically primary skills are essentially skills that we, by virtue of being human, just acquire. Often they're linked to developmental milestones like crawling, walking, sitting up in childhood. So at one level, we can think of biologically primary skills as being necessary for survival. There's also other aspects such as communication, turn-taking, the natural desire to interact with other humans. I'm going to not take such the evolutionary route, but talk about the importance of biologically primary skills for students entering school. Ideally, we want students to enter with a full set of well-developed biologically primary skills. If you think about language, communication, motor skills, social skills, and so forth. Biologically primary skills are fundamental for children to have benefit from being at school. Clearly, we know that not all children enter school with fully equipped biologically primary skills, and we've got data such as the AEDC, if anyone follows that Australian Early Developmental Census. So we know that at some schools or for some students, there is some catch-up that needs to be done. But essentially, we think about biologically primary skills that the human brain has evolved to just acquire through our maturation in our early years. Here are some examples, and this is a non-exhaustive list. There are obviously many, many other things. In contrast, I'd like to focus today on biologically secondary skills, which can be thought of as domain-specific skills that must be taught. If no one taught us how to do a range of biologically secondary skills, we wouldn't know how to do them. So examples of biologically secondary skills, once again, a very non-exhaustive list, but reading and writing is there, and that's often an area where there's been lots of disputes in what's been referred to as the reading wars. The fact that there's been a view that reading is natural, like learning to speak, and it's not. Doing calculus, flying a plane, and again, you can probably think of many others. And the purpose of education is to teach students biologically secondary skills, skills that they would not acquire or master or learn if no one taught them how to do so. So my focus is on reading and other aspects of literacy, but it applies across the board. And when I talk about purpose of education, clearly schools, but also universities, TAFEs, short courses, anything that we do where we are wanting to master something. And that's also a critical point around learning as a novice. We think of novice, the word novice conjures up a sense of young people, school-age children entering school, but a novice is also a 15-year-old who's going into their very first physics class and doesn't have background knowledge in physics. A novice means by virtue of not having background knowledge or experience being taught something, we are novice. So we're all novices at different times, regardless of our age and stage. So it's really important to acknowledge that writing, the written language system, which comprises reading, writing and spelling, is a human contrivance. It's only been around for 3,000 to 5,000 years. Compared to communication, which has been around for, we don't really know how long, but because it's biologically primary, we are somehow pre-wired to want to communicate and to learn to communicate. And for anyone who has raised children, seen young babies, you can see that desire, intent to communicate is so innately driven. Oral language, Pam talks about oral language as getting up much earlier than reading and writing, which it literally has from an evolutionary perspective. So it does have an evolutionary advantage that reading and writing doesn't have. Like, who knows, in hundreds of thousands of years, we might also have evolved to become readers and writers in a pre-wired sense, but we will never know if that is actually the case. So whilst we're talking about the brain, and I've talked about the biologically primary, biologically secondary aspects, and that there's a sameness about the human brain, we also acknowledge that every child brings themselves to school with their own linguistic... I've just lost the screen. Sorry, I've just lost... Thank you. Whilst every child brings their own language, linguistic, cultural history, social history to school with them, every child is absolutely unique. When we think about learning to read, and this applies to other biologically secondary skills as well, we all learn in roughly the same way. We all have the same brain with the same structures, the same four lobes, the same corpus callosum down the middle and everything else. So the brain doesn't learn differently for children who are second language learners or who have a particular diagnosis. We all learn in roughly the same way. So the way that we teach students really needs to be guided by principles related to cognitive science, and where we vary things up is in the dosage, the intensity, the pace of the delivery, rather than doing something different for different students. Again, I'm not going to go down the learning styles route. I'm happy to talk about that with anyone in the break, but it really puts the learning styles, which now is established as a myth, really puts that myth to bed, because we know what happens in the brain to optimise our learning. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple of models of reading. I'm not going to focus on them for too long, but before I do, I'd really like to pick up on the comment made by George Box, who was a statistician that Greg also referred to this morning. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So do please keep that in mind as I take you through a couple of the models that we're going to talk about today. When we think about models of reading, it's considered to be a framework that describes understanding of the reading process, particularly the reading comprehension process. So it's not a diagnostic tool, it's not a curriculum, it's really just setting up a framework so that we can understand more about the reading process. And that's where, again, particularly with models like the reading rope, I've certainly heard people say with the very best of intentions, we do all the strands of the reading rope, but it's not designed to be individual strands as it's shown. It's a model or a framework of what really constitutes a comprehensive reading instruction program to help all students reach proficiency. So I'm going to talk about the simple view of reading, which again I'm sure is familiar to many people here, but I'd like to give you a brief historical context for the simple view of reading, which was published in 1986, and in my view its timing really was just bad, unfortunately. So if we go back to the 1960s, that's when whole language was born, and it became deeply embedded as not just in education but as a very much part of a socio-cultural revolution. This is the perspective that children need to be immersed in beautiful text, given beautiful books, and they will learn somehow by osmosis that they will come to love reading and learn to read. And because that wasn't going so well, in the 1980s, balanced literacy was introduced kind of as an attempt to counter the fact that the purest whole language wasn't good. We perhaps need to sort of sprinkle a bit of phonics in there as well to try and counter what was going on in classrooms, the poor outcomes for students across the board. The Simple View of Reading was published in 1986 by Goff and Tunma. And things still weren't going very well. Balanced literacy was certainly the dominant mode of instruction across English-speaking countries. Sorry, this is jumping around. And then in 2000, the National Reading Panel was convened. This was a panel of experts in America. And again, this was in response to reduced reading proficiency outcomes that was really very, very concerning. And this was a significant milestone. It was really the birth of privileging evidence in education, and that's really been a turning point. And then today, even though The Simple View of Reading was published in 1986, it essentially sat on bookshelves and collected dust because of the context of where it appeared. The National Reading Panel and 2 other significant reports, one out of England and one out of Australia, really put The Simple View of Reading back on the map. So that's just a sort of brief background as to 1986. It's a long time ago now. In many ways, people could see it as quite stale, but it really holds as much influence then. It didn't get the attention that it needed then and holds influence now. Keep in mind, it's a model and all models are wrong, but some are really helpful. So the Simple View of Reading explains reading competencies at all ages. It's not something just for young children. It can explain reading competency at all ages and stages and is a valuable and research-validated model, but again, not an instructional program in and of itself. And this is what it looks like. It's very simple. It doesn't mean that reading is simple because we know it's anything but simple, but the model or the formula, as you can see, it's an equation, is simple. So it tells us that reading comprehension, which is the ultimate aim of reading on the right-hand side, is a product of being able to recognise words and understand the oral language in the text. Now, the critical thing is that it's a multiplication, it's not additive. So if you're poor in one area, it cannot compensate for strengths in another area. Anything times 0 is going to be 0. So the ability to recognise words, and I used to, if depend on what you read, you might see in that first circle, it says decoding. That was the original wording, and it's not wrong. It's just that authors since have talked about the fact that we have to be able to read the word efficiently and automatically to really speed up, to really get the reading process going. So that's why you'll see differences in the terminology, but essentially they're talking about getting the words off the page in an efficient and, of course, accurate way, multiplied by our oral language comprehension is going to result in reading comprehension. And so the 2 highlighted there are both about language. One is in the discourse, verbal or oral discourse, or perhaps the signed discourse, depending on modality of language, and one is in the written context, reading comprehension. So we can say that reading is conceptualised as a product of being able to get the words off the page and put meaning around what is in the text. And doesn't really specify this in this model, but models since have really highlighted the critical importance of background knowledge. I'll give you some examples shortly, but put simply, if we read about something that's really out of our knowledge zone, if I asked you to read some astrophysics information, and presumably most of you don't have that knowledge, you probably will sound a bit like a less capable reader because there'll be a lot of terminology, a lot of words you've never seen and come across. So background knowledge is absolutely essential component as well, and we will look at that a little bit later as well. So if I gave you that text up there, which is in Latin, you would be able to recognise the words. It's a familiar script to you, but unless you've got Latin, or perhaps some of you who have some Italian, you would be falling over at the language comprehension stage. So of course, there is no reading comprehension happening. If I showed it to you in Chechen, again, unless there are any Chechen speakers or readers in the room, you can't even get off first base. So seeing both sides of the equation at 0. And again, these are very contrived examples, but just to demonstrate how the simple view of reading works. But if I showed it to you in English, he likes to sleep, which is what the other 2 statements were, you would have no difficulty. And even if I said it to you in more sophisticated, or what's often referred to as literate style language, he privileges an afternoon siesta, which is the same content, you would be able to read it. So we're seeing you're able to get the words off the page and understand. And of course, this is a simple example. And even longer words, you might need a couple of goes at looking at that word. You might like to just try that under your breath now, but once you really break it up into morphemes and some familiar di and trigraphs, you would get the word. And I'd like to ask you just to have a go at reading that one, just for the fun of it. I'll give you 15 seconds to do so. Okay, 1, 2, 3. So This word, I'm not going to try and pronounce it myself. I have tried to practice it many times. But as you make your way through the word, you would literally be decoding through the word from left to right. You probably notice lots of morpheme elements that you could recognise, and it means a fear of long words. But let's put the simple view of reading to work now. This is the quadrant model that many authors have used as to frame the different subtypes of reading. So in this quadrant model, only one of the 4 boxes is a proficient reader. So you can see here we've got the elements, the language comprehension and word recognition, and we're going to plot a reader. So students who have strengths in both will typically be on track for reading. They'll make a good start and continue on that way. So we're really pleased to see those children, but the other 3 show some sort of difficulty that we need to step in ideally early to support them with. Students in the bottom left quadrant, you can see, are lower than they ideally should be, and so they have what's considered to be a mixed disability. These students will declare themselves early in their school life, particularly in the very first year of school, because learning to decode will be more difficult for them, and they have the added difficulty of perhaps having a language delay, maybe a restricted vocab, poor grammatical understanding as well. So these students are the mixed disability students and need early and immediate intensive intervention. Students on the bottom left quadrant are the students by position. If you just plot them, their oral language skills are where they should be, maybe even better, but they are struggling to learn to decode. Some of these children may go on to receive a diagnosis of dyslexia. Some of these children just don't learn to decode because no one's taught them in a systematic way. Whatever the case is, they need intervention, and they will declare themselves also very early in school. And the students in the upper left quadrant are slightly less frequent, they don't appear as often, but they have the reverse profile to the dyslexia, so-called dyslexia group, in that they learn to decode pretty quickly. In fact, some of these children they're quite precocious with their decoding and will come to school looking like they're reading, but in fact they're not processing a lot of the language context and content. Hyperlexia, hyper meaning extreme and lexia meaning words, so really good with words but not processing a lot of the text. Now, the majority of students that you will or have met in your travels will fall into either the mixed or the poor decoding or poor word recognition frame. About 15% of poor readers meet the criteria for poor comprehenders, as they're often referred to as well. But this is all drawn from how the simple view of reading can help us classify students as to where they may fit on this profile. Now, I'm going to just turn to the science of reading now and just talk a little bit about what it means, what it doesn't mean, and current update. This is an image of the Science of Reading a little booklet. It's freely downloadable from the Reading League. If you haven't seen it, I really would encourage you to have a look at it. They tell us that reading science has been going on for decades, and that's what the concerning thing is, that we've known a lot about how the human brain learns to read, or the most effective and efficient way of teaching students to read and identifying struggling readers early so that we can intervene early. That research has been going on for decades, really the last 5 decades. It's a vast interdisciplinary body of knowledge about reading and issues related to reading and writing. So from developmental and cognitive psychologists, linguists, far less influence from educators, although that is slowly changing. But like any science of climate, science of virology, it's never settled. It's not a settled debate. Science, by virtue of being an evidence-based discipline, is always growing and changing on the basis of new information that comes along. Aero also talk about the science of reading, telling us that the science of reading looks at the essential cognitive processes for competent reading and describes how reading develops in both typical and atypical readers. So it's really just a body of knowledge, and where I think people can get hung up is that it's set, this is the way it is, and no science is ever like that. So anyone that really privileges or says they privilege the science of reading should really be retaining and maintaining an open mind to what we mean by the science of reading. I want to talk to you now about the influence of the National Reading Panel, which is now over a quarter of a century old. So once again, in some people's view, it's a bit stale, but it was really a turning point. They again gave us another model, often referred to as the Big Five, but it really put evidence-based, privileging evidence in the way that we approach reading instruction on the map, and it also put oral language front and centre on the map as well. So the report is available to download if you want to read it, but one of the things that they came up with was these 5 pillars of reading that you can see here. They talk about the pillars. It's my graphic interpretation, but the pillars are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency as in reading fluency, not speaking fluency, vocabulary and comprehension. So that was really, really valuable in identifying aspects of what needed to be in a comprehensive reading instruction program. What it how it has been misinterpreted is that they were essentially siloed. So it's comprehensive, but there was a risk of it being interpreted, okay, I've done phonemic awareness, now I teach my children phonics, then I teach them fluency, and so it goes. So it was an incredibly valuable turning point, and I'm forever grateful. But as models go and as science goes, it has moved on. Some of you may be more familiar with Desley Cons's Big Six. So she expanded on the 5, and I know that various departments of education around the country, some of them talk about the Big 5, some of them talk about the Big 6, but what she did was add in the role of early language, oral language and early literacy, as in pre-reading skills, being able to know how books work, that print has meaning, it's not just random squiggles and so forth. So again, I'm not suggesting that you take one or the other, preference one or the other. Personally, I feel like the oral language side that has been added is kind of embedded in everything else, but that's just a personal view. But she really wanted to add that into the mix as well. But once again, oral language is really being privileged. I'd like to share this image that Pam created again, that these big ideas, whether you talk about 5 or 6, are interrelated just as our fingers are on our hands. You can see the 5 elements, and that oral language and early literacy experiences kind of hold everything together. The current situation in Australia in terms of reading proficiency, I feel like the media does a pretty big job on telling us that things aren't going well, but they unfortunately have some evidence to say that things aren't going well. We've got things like NAPLAN and so forth. The current situation is not ideal. Reading outcomes for Australian school leavers have been stagnant for some time. There's certainly talk in the media of declines. I would say that the evidence is not as strong in terms of a dip, but there's been a stagnancy for quite a number of decades, and that's in spite of the knowledge that we have from researchers in the science of reading and the learning sciences space. That's in light of the enormous amount of funding that's gone into education. There's been a stagnant levels, and it's exacerbated by students who already experience social disadvantage just because of their circumstances. NAPLAN data breaks it down beautifully, where you can see that 1 in 3 students on average is not at proficient reading levels, but it's almost 1 in 2 when you go into things like Indigenous students, students who are living in poverty and other social disadvantage. So the evidence is still that about 1 in 3 children are not meeting reading proficiency, and that's fairly consistent across the NAPLAN year levels. This is data that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen of PISA data, which is an international measure. So Australia is in the blue, the top jagged line. The black line is just a good fit. You can see a dip there, and the orange line is the average. So we are doing better than a lot of other countries, but we shouldn't be excited. Well, I don't feel excited about that, because you can see that there is a slant going the way that we don't want things to go. And we are a first world country that is well funded, lots of knowledge, lots of great intent, lots of funding has been put into education. That should not be happening, and there's many, many reasons why. This is NAPLAN Year 3 reading from last year. I haven't seen such a beautiful graph yet from this year's results, but it looks very similar. So you can, most of you are Queenslanders, we're a few of us from Victoria and New South Wales here, but if I just draw your attention to the bottom line of Australian average, can see here there's the 30% of children that aren't reading proficiently in grade 3. So whilst there's about 66% of students doing well or very well, which is pretty exciting, and many will get very, very pats on the back for that, but that's mean 1 in 3 is being left behind. And what unfortunately we know is that if you don't get off to a good start with reading, if students don't get off to a good start, it's very, very hard to catch up. This research by Spira and her colleagues in 2005 told us that things are pretty set by the time you get to grade 3. It does not mean that intervention can't help, because it can if it's presented early, it's presented intensively, and all of the good things we know about intervention. That I can answer questions about later if you have questions, but ideally we really need to get students in intervention so you close a much smaller gap early on than a much larger gap, plus all of the other psychosocial consequences that are likely to arise, like I'm dumb, I suck at school, and so forth. This pretty graph took me a long time to get my head around, but it came out of an Aero study in 2023, and I'd just like to draw your attention. I don't have a... No. Okay, draw your attention to the bottom part of the graph. You can see here there's the year 3 students at or below in the brown, that sort of tanny brown box. And you can see the trajectory going forward into year 5, year 7 and year 9. So we can see here that if you're in that bottom band in year 3, nearly 2/3 remain. So in grade 5 of those 2/3, 70% or so are still there in year 7, and close to 80% are still there in year 9. So from beginning to end, if you start off not doing well in year 3, there is a 37.4% of students remain so at year 9. You can see again a lot of waves going on, but I just want to draw your attention to that bottom part of the graph. So getting off to a good start is extremely important. So let's now turn our attention to the meaty bit, the transition to literacy. So we know that reading is a language-based task, but strong oral skills are really important, but they're not enough on their own. Pam and I talk about this notion of crossing the bridge from being able to verbally communicate effectively to transitioning those skills into the act of reading and writing, keeping in mind that it's a biologically secondary skill. So a quick recap on oral language. We're just referring to everyday talking and listening and all of the mental representations that sit behind them: grammar, semantics, pragmatics, discourse, things like understanding narrative, story grammar, and so forth. So if you go back to the simple view of reading, I want to just focus in on the language comprehension part. And to be able to understand what we read, these are some of the linguistic or language skills that need to be embedded. Knowledge about sentence structure and its relationship to semantics. So let me explain that a bit more. If I said to you, the cow is in the field, that is grammatically correct. In English, it's a subject, verb, object sentence with a prepositional phrase. And semantically, they hold together well. The cow is in the field. But if I said the cow painted on the table, the cow painted on the white, I had an example that's just gone. The cow drove at the farm or something like that. Again, it's grammatically correct, but semantically very incoherent. So vocabulary is really important in and of itself, but also for matching it with sentence structure. And also vocabulary is not just what words mean, but using words for much more abstract concepts as well. Being able to have flexible knowledge about language. If you look at the examples, it could be wind, it could be wind, convict or convict. And I've just put the word bug in there. I'd just like you to take a moment and think about how many ways you could use the word bug in a sentence that makes sense. And there's probably quite a few. We also need to know about the purpose and style of different discourse and genres. And above all, we have to have background knowledge about what we're reading. So here is some work done by Hugh Katz and his colleagues. His work has really helped me understand the role of oral language. I'll just briefly take you through this. This is a longitudinal study, and you can see here data from students from 2nd to 10th grade. Their study was set up as follows. They took over 600 children. Close to half had what they called then language impairment. The terminology has changed. A spoken language impairment identified before school. And the other half of the students had typical language. So you can see the TL and the LI. But in the left-hand graph, the students with typical language are in the solid line and the language impaired are in the dotted line. And this graph shows their word reading skills as they are progressing through the year levels, their ability to read lists of words. So like any word reading test that you might do. So in second grade, the typical language children are above their language impaired peers. The language impaired peers make gains pretty much at the same trajectory as their typical language peers, but they always are behind. I tried to draw superimpose some lines to match up the year levels, and I really didn't have to increase the size of the bar that I superimposed, maybe a tiny fraction by year 10, but essentially the trajectory, you can see that there is a delay profile the whole way if you started off school with language skills not quite at level. On the right-hand side, it's exactly the same process, but instead of testing word reading skills, they tested language comprehension. Same process. The language impaired kids make progress, but you can see that the trajectory is flatter. So here again, I really did have to lengthen the lines that I superimposed, and that's often referred to conceptually as the Matthew effect. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. If you start off strong, continue on a strong trajectory, start off a bit behind, and the trajectory flattens out. So if I showed you, if we think about novice, from novice to expert readers, I just want to talk firstly about what we mean by word reading. So we mean things that are probably very, very obvious to you, but it's really important to just make sure we're all talking the same language. It means getting a word off the page via the graphemes inside that word, whether it's by very deliberate decoding, which is what you saw in the first clip, or whether it's much more instant recognition, which is what you were starting to see in the second clip. As long as you can get the words off the page by attending to the graphemes, digraphs, whatever makeup of the word, if that's your cue into reading the word. It doesn't mean we're not talking about guessing, we're not talking about using multi-cueing, and we're not talking about visual recall of whole words. So I really just want to make that really clear. If I showed you this sample, again, you could probably grind your way through it and maybe even see a few words that you think look a bit familiar to what we know in English, but because you don't have the language, again, Latin, it's about COVID, you can read it completely easily when it is presented in English because you are able to get the words off the page and then attach meaning within sentences and ideally between sentences as well. So let's now look at how we get words off the page and the two steps, the phonic decoding and the orthographic mapping. Here is a model that David Kilpatrick's put forward. And I'm going to focus on the decoding, which is when children are learning about grapheme-phoneme correspondences in order to sound out unfamiliar words. And that is exactly what you saw in the first clip that I showed. So if we take a word, any word, there are many ways to break up that word. For example, west, 4 letters, 1 morpheme, 1 syllable, and 4 graphemes. It's a very easy word, and it's easy because each grapheme has a direct relationship to a phoneme. There's nothing complex. It's very transparent. Our language is not transparent, but there are, of course, many words that have a one-to-one relationship. So we teach children to segment out and blend it back together, and we would start off with words maybe not west, but similar, where there's a one-to-one relationship. So we're stripping back a lot of complexity while children are starting to master a series of grapheme-phoneme correspondences. But we know that English is a morphophonemic language. Most of our words are bi- or multi-syllabic, and we also have a semi-transparent orthography, unlike languages such as Italian or Finnish, where there's a more semi-transparent orthography. So it gets a little bit more complex if we have the word fish. Once again, 4 letters, 1 morpheme, 1 syllable, but 3 graphemes. So students are starting to have to learn about the fact that SH needs to be, that's a digraph making the sh sound. Then it gets a little bit more complex. If you read this word here, if you try to read that by looking at the letters alone, if you might want to have a go at that second line, you're going to get yourself into a bit of a mess. Okay. It's also got a number of morphemes that more proficient readers will be able to take advantage of, but in the early days, it's really through the graphemes that are children's way into reading a word. So graphemes provide the requisite knowledge about how to read words. And these are the lead into decoding of words, especially for the novice reader, which is why you saw particularly the younger child who was in first year of school doing a lot of quite deliberate decoding. As she and other readers get more proficient, they will take advantage of morphemes within the word, not just to read it, but also for meaning. So if you think about the word euphonic, the IC relates to a characteristic, phon relates to sound, and eu relates to good or well. So we've also got words like euthanasia, euphoria, eulogy. So we can also teach a lot of language as well through morphemes. So why we talk about English as a morphophonemic language. Just checking how I'm going for time. Okay. Yes, so here you can see that if you go in through the graphemes, children have to know these, in this case, these digraphs, but if they tried to read it through letters alone, they would really not be very successful. So here are the clips again, but I won't have time to replay them. I want to jump down now to orthographic mapping, which is what we all do all the time. We instantly recognise words because we're just so practised at reading the words. We don't have to deliberately decode most words, but of course, if you come across words that I presented to you earlier, of course you will have to, because they're unfamiliar, they're particularly long, but most of the words we orthographically map. So first of all, as a demonstration, follow the cue on here. And I'd say that it's pretty much impossible. You can't not read the word, and that's because you have got a very big orthographic lexicon, and you can't not read it. It's just there. You just automatically go to it, and you can't just shut it off. So that's what, in a sort of a crude way, orthographic mapping looks like. If you think about the word orthography, orthography refers to the conventions of the writing system, ortho meaning right or correct, and graph meaning writing, so correct writing. I was going to ask you what happened when you saw this, but I think I'm just going to skip that in the interests of time, and show you these examples. If you think about orthography as the spelling system of a language, many people also talk about it as the whole writing system, including punctuation. But in terms of reading, orthographic mapping occurs when we have retained a word or elements within the word, such as a morpheme or a die or a trigraph. We've seen it and we're so well practiced and well rehearsed that you don't have to go bow. It just jumps out at you, whether it's a short word. It doesn't matter if it's a short or a long word. If you've seen it a few times, 3, 4, 5 times typically, it will become orthographically mapped. Some authors talk about them as sight words. I personally emphasise the personal perspective. Try and avoid that word just to avoid confusion with things like the 100-word sight words and so forth. But essentially, it feels like you're reading by sight. Again, if you think about the example with calculate. Kilpatrick refers to it. I find this a slightly clunky explanation, but he talks about it as the mental process we use to permanently store words for immediate and effortless retrieval. And that's the reading fluency, and that's what we're often practicing with students. They've learned the grapheme-phoneme correspondences. They know a lot about the different combinations of letters, but we've got to get students reading fluently so that it becomes the constrained skill of, I can read most words that come across. I'm going to put my cognitive energy into understanding what the text is actually saying. And the final part, I'm just going to whiz through a couple of slides and just go to our last section on understanding what we read. Now, we could talk we could have a whole day conference on reading comprehension, and I'm going to do it really briefly today, but once again, we're talking about the importance of extracting and constructing meaning from the text that we see. And here is Tiffany Hogan and her colleagues' reading house. You can see here that right at the very top, at the peak, of course, reading comprehension, the ultimate goal, but there's the simple view of reading. On the left-hand side, we've got all our bits and pieces to get words off the page, whether it's deliberately decoding or orthographically mapping, and it's over here that we're really interested in the language. Now, vocabulary and grammar are seen as the lower order language skills that we just need, and then we need to have inferencing skills, comprehension monitoring, filtering skills and text structure knowledge skills in order to be able to understand whether it's in the written modality or in the spoken modality. So what I'd like to do just to encapsulate this and talk to you about the Kinch model, which really does bring together so much about language and also background knowledge that we bring to the task of reading. And in this model, we talk about a text base and a mental model. Now, the text base is literally defined as the representation that we create immediately, almost at a surface level, when we read something. So if I give you these two examples, I don't want you to try and think too deeply about them. You just read about a girl, Molly, you know is female because you know that's a girl's name, spilt a drink and Dan rushed to get a cloth, and the other example. So you're just getting a very sort of superficial sense of what happened. Now, if you don't know stuff about the world, for example, what coffee is and that it's hot and Molly might get burnt and all of the other things that you can associate, you won't really understand why Dan got a cloth, let alone why he rushed to get a cloth, and a whole lot of other inferences that you make by virtue of the background knowledge that you bring to the task. And the same with the second example about particular plants. If you don't know what a cactus is, that sentence will she just stopped at a cactus, but we don't really know why. And that's because when we do really interpret text, we form a mental model, which is the ultimate process of getting meaning off the page. And a mental model is when we organise a text's multiple propositions into an integrated whole. And to do that, you've got to be able to read efficiently, you've got to understand what you're reading, but you've also got to incorporate your own prior knowledge to the task. So if I present to you the same statements, you formed, no doubt, a strong mental model about the inferences inside those, the three sentences, one that's joined and one single statement, because you are able to bring your background knowledge, your knowledge of the world, even simple things that, gender, garden and watering, that you've got to water a garden, things that will seem so apparent to you, but may not necessarily be apparent in terms of the background knowledge that readers bring to the task, and therefore find it hard to form a mental model. The critical thing with a mental model is that it's dynamic. So if you start off teaching a unit of study on photosynthesis, students might create a very hazy mental model at the start, and as they learn more, the same text will sing louder to them. They'll make a lot more sense of it. So mental model is dynamic, and we're trying to build students' mental model. Now, I'm very aware of time, so I'm going to just again skip through a couple of slides and just want to ask you again to reflect on the word bugs. We need a lot of language flexibility. We've got to go to the higher order skills. I am really close to finishing. I've just got a few examples there. We can see the word bug is used as a noun, as a verb, and with very, very different meanings as well. So when we read, we've got to know which version of bug, which version of convict was meant. Is it wind? The wind was strong. It's not the wind was strong. So we've got to have a lot of flexibility. We've got to have the ability to understand things like ambiguity. The duck is ready to eat. Grandma's ready to eat, and children make delicious snacks, could all be interpreted in a number of ways. And then there's just beautiful text that I've lifted from Lemony Snicket's series, which says, I will love you as a thief loves a gallery and a crow loves a murder. There's a lot of depth in there that you'd have to bring to really make sense of that. So just to finish off, reading, back to our man who looks like he's just loving what he's reading. Reading involves the interaction between the skills and cognitive processes of the reader, how quick you are, how efficient you are at reading, how much background knowledge, how much vocab, how much language, etc. So a lot about what the reader brings to the task and the linguistic characteristics of the text. I won't show the examples on the earlier slides, but if you do want to have a look, I've given you two examples where you maybe don't have a lot of background knowledge and when you do have a lot of background knowledge. So the linguistic characteristics of the text really influence our ability to read any text, and that's why reading comprehension is particularly difficult to answer. So in closing, I'm just going to close with my headline messages as a way of you thinking about what resonated for you, what you might like to follow up on, and of course I can answer any questions at another time. But I've talked about the fact that humans are not born with a reading brain, that reading is a language-based set of skills. It's multi-componential, and that oral language and written language share many of the same underlying processes, but oral language needs to be extended well beyond the school entry years. Children arrive at school with oral language, but the oral language skills of a 5-year-old will never be sufficient for a student in year 10. So oral language needs to be at the forefront of educators' minds in school as well. Reading comprehension is difficult to assess. It's not a thing you can just practice and get better at. There's so many factors that support it and also that might make you vulnerable with reading comprehension. And that reading comprehension is a really important long life predictor of satisfaction, success and fulfilment. So thank you very much for your attention and for participating in the activities. There's a full reference list if you need. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Serry, for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. If anyone has questions, they're welcome to come to the front a little bit later, but we will take this opportunity to move on very soon to our final round of workshops. The conference format is such that we won't gather again at the end of the day for closing remarks. It's very important to us that this conference is always an opportunity for you, teachers, to talk with other teachers. And so therefore, when your afternoon workshop finishes, you're most welcome to stay on in the classrooms that you are in or to gather at the coffee shop. For those of you staying on this weekend, I encourage you to enjoy our Riverfire festivities. And for those of you heading home, I wish you safe travels. I thank you all for your attendance today, and I invite you now to head off to your final workshop. Thank you.